Okay, everybody, we can go ahead and start. I know the River of Life crowd, they do a Rosh Chodesh service on the 1st of, I think that's what they said they were doing tonight. At any rate, I'm not sure where they are. But we may not have as many people in class tonight. And really what I had planned for tonight was to do something a little more structured. And the more I studied the material that was coming together in my mind, the less structured I can see it's going to be, because I want to look at some things in the Torah portion as they relate to Chanukah, as they relate to Rachel, the shepherdess, in workbook 2, which we're also studying. Sometimes everything just converges for me. And that's how I tend to see things. I study pieces of things, but ultimately that piece finds a place within the big picture. And tonight, I saw a piece that I'm not sure I've ever picked it out before. If I did, I forgot about it. But it has to do with Rachel and understanding Rachel as, in the terms of the rule of first mention, the first mention of a shepherd is not a shepherd. It's a shepherdess. It's Rachel. And so our first, it's not that she's the first shepherd, she's not. She's just the first specific word mentioned. Like ro'eh is shepherd. And if you know a little bit of Hebrew, or you know your Hebrew roots, if I say ro'eh, you know that, make sure I'm recording. Okay. Ro'eh means seeing, like he's seeing something. It's present tense. So if I say ro'eh, you have to know the context to know whether I say he's seeing something or shepherd, because they're sound-alikes. And so for a shepherdess, it's ro'ah, making it feminine. And that first specific mention of the shepherd root is in relation to Rachel. When Jacob encounters her at the well, in a Torah portion we've already looked at in Genesis 29, I think. And I want to go back and look at that chapter because I want you to see some things that are going to tie us to Joseph and his name. We did a lesson last week on name repentance. What does it mean to live up to your name in the kingdom? Because every name, like every word, has both a positive or a negative possibility. It depends on the state of your obedience to that word, or in terms of your name, in your state of obedience to the word, so that you would live up to that name. So you could have a good name that's based on your deeds. The very same name could also be a bad name based on your deeds, based on your faithfulness. So Rachel, we know, means ewe lamb. So in her name, we see a doubling of a concept, and that's important. When a concept is doubled, then we have to pay attention. For instance, if you hear sometimes when the Holy One is calling someone, he'll say the name twice. He'll say Moses, Moses, or he'll say Abraham, Abraham. And when you see that doubling, you know that a prophetic call is going forth. And the proper response to that call is, here I am. In Rachel's case, it's a little more subtle. And first of all, we would have to know what her name even meant in Hebrew. But she is both a shepherdess, a roah, and her name itself means a ewe lamb, all right, a female sheep. So we've got a sheep association here. And we know that Joseph was kidnapped when he was out looking for his brothers who were tending sheep. But if we're trying to find the first mention of a shepherd without using the actual word, without actually saying the word ro'eh, to say shepherd, but someone whose occupation we know is a shepherd, then we go all the way back to the beginning, to the story of Cain and Abel. Because as it turns out, Joseph wasn't that great a shepherd. We know that he was a tattletale on his brothers who were also shepherds. But when we read the Hebrew text that week, if we read it in Hebrew, when he's out looking for his brothers, his shepherd brothers, it says that Joseph is blundering in the field. He's not just losing his way, he doesn't know what he's doing. All right? And so his shepherding instinct needed to be honed. And if we're not good shepherds, then if that is the calling upon our lives, then guess what is going to happen? Then suffering and hardship will come into our lives to make us better shepherds. Just like Jacob, when he ran from Esau, Esau was the one who was a man of the field. Jacob was a man of the tents. He was a plain man. He liked to study. He was a quiet man. He was a simple man, a peaceful man, it says, dwelling in tents. And so what does Jacob have to learn? He has to learn how to be a shepherd. It didn't come naturally to Jacob to be a shepherd because he himself tells us how many sheep he lost. He says, I stayed out in the rain and the cold and the sunlight and the moonlight, and if the wild animals tore them, I was the one who bore the loss. But through experience and that suffering that he tells us about, he becomes a good shepherd. And in fact, the first thing he does when he comes back to the land itself, it says he builds Sukkot for his sheep and his goats. So he has developed the instincts of a good shepherd. And remember, a good shepherd is one that guards the sheep. Like Jacob said, even when it's inconvenient, even when he himself has to bear the loss, even when it's cold and it's rainy and it's no fun and the sheep don't appreciate it because sheep are just dumb. They don't know what you're doing for them. But Jacob learned to not just gather sheep, but Jacob learned how to increase the sheep. Joseph was blundering in the field, and he had to learn the same thing as his father. He had to learn how to gather his brothers instead of scatter them. Because remember, the original dream was he would gather them, except he kind of misperceived the whole point of it. The way that he's telling it to his brothers and father, you can tell that somehow in his telling of the dream, what they're drawing away from it, even Jacob says, well, what do you think? You're going to lord over us? Like, you think this dream means you're going to be the boss? Are you going to be a little dictator? And so he wasn't seeing the dream the same at first in his immaturity as he saw the dream in his maturity. Because at the end, what does he do? He gathers them. He becomes a better shepherd. In fact, he becomes a shepherd of people, not just sheep. In all his hardship and all his suffering in prison, what does he learn how to do? He learns how to gather instead of scatter. And so when the brothers realize who he is, they become very afraid. He says, no, don't be afraid because, the Holy One planned this. It was just, we were just the pieces in the plan. But it was his plan that I be able to save you. And now, see, he's interpreting the dream differently. It's not about them bowing down to him, although they did. That's how we know that that particular dream is being fulfilled. But we realize that he's misperceived the whole point of the dream. It wasn't for him to be the Lord and dictator, even over his father, over the entire family. The dream was about being able to be a good shepherd and to gather not just his brothers who had turned on him, but also be able to gather his father in his old age, to be able to gather his little brother so that through this, they would learn how to get along. So becoming a good shepherd is not a casual thing. And so if we go back to the first mention of a shepherd, we know we land in the Cain and the Abel story. And it's because Abel was a good shepherd that his offering, his gift, was approved. And it was Abel's inability as a shepherd, even though he's bringing produce, what would have been the equivalent of being a good shepherd in Cain's case? Had he considered his brother and considered they were a family unit, and the gift on the altar was actually going to be consumed by his brother, then he would have brought the best that he had, which would have been offering the best first to Elohim, and then also extending that to his brother, to his own family, so that their gathering, Miketz Yamim, which is making us think of Sukkot, they would both be good shepherds because they would both bring their best for the benefit of the other brother. What we saw in the early story of Joseph and his brothers is they weren't bringing their best. And we get little hints as to their transformation so that they become better shepherds. And in this portion, what I know maybe with tomorrow's class, I can break down the individual numbers and what they represent. But I want to look at the number 14. It's if you have a copy of, I guess this is the latest edition of Workbook 5, Volume 1. It's on page 264. But I also want to go back and look at Genesis 29, if you have your Bible close. And then we'll actually go over to Workbook 2 for a little bit and try to pull all this scattered stuff together. So if you're trying to keep up with the reading, you're probably going to end up with 3 or 4 things scattered across your desk. But 14 is known as the number of Messiah, or the number of Mashiach. And we get little hints. The generations that are listed in the Gospels, you get 14 generation increments to Messiah. But we know that as Jacob is working for Laban in Haran, which is why I want to go back to where Jacob encounters Rachel, he tells Laban, I've served you 20 years. And he breaks it down. We've got 14 years for 2 daughters. So that would be 7 and 7, 7 for one daughter, 7 for the other daughter. That adds up to 14. And in the paradigm, we know that the matriarchs are symbols or metaphors of the Holy Spirit working in the lives of the patriarchs, because they're always, if not pointing them back to the land, because of their wives, they end up going back to the land with greater wealth, with the cattle, the sheep and the goats and the camels and the male and the female servants and so forth. But in Jacob's case, it was the counsel of his 2 wives for whom he worked 14 years. When they said, we've got nothing here, let's go back to your land. Let's go back to the land of your fathers. So once he serves that 14 years, he works an additional 6 years for the livestock. And we know as he bred those livestock, he specifically bred them to have different colors and coat patterns so that they weren't just all black sheep. They weren't all just white sheep. They weren't all just white sheep with black faces. They were all kinds of colors. They were streaked and speckled and spotted and all sorts of good stuff. And so there's 6 years that he works for them. And as one more time, one of the patriarchs brings sheep and goats back to the land, we saw earlier how when he built Sukkot for them, it represented the nations coming back to Jerusalem to observe the Feast of the Nations, Sukkot. There's another 14, other than the generations of 14 to Messiah. We know that at Sukkot, Solomon dedicated the first temple. And when he dedicated the first temple at Sukkot, he didn't follow the letter of the Torah. He observed 7 days of Sukkot in the dedication, but he also added 7 more days plus 1 day, which you have to have the 8th day attached to Sukkot, because it's both a 7-day celebration and an 8th day celebration. The 8th day is part of and separate from those 7 days. So a double Sukkot that adds up to 14 of Sukkot plus the 8th day is without the sukkah. I don't know if you've ever really read that carefully, the commandments of Sukkot, but it's only 7 days that you dwell in Sukkot, and then on that 8th day, you don't dwell in the sukkah. Right? It's the same but different, set apart. So is Sukkot a 7-day or an 8th-day feast? Yes. And that's kind of the picture of Hanukkah. One of the questions that came up last weekend at the conference was, why does a Chanukiah, because I had been teaching on the of Hanukkah as the Sukkot Sheni, that second Sukkot that was instituted because the first one was missed on account of a corpse. And someone said, yeah, but it has 9. If it's supposed to be about 8 days, why does it have 9? And Rabbi Lux cleared that up for us. Basically, the 9th has no function other than to light the others. It's the 8 lights that are considered the important thing. The 9th is just kind of that extra, that it has a usefulness, it has a utility role. But in terms of symbolism, he says it's the 8 that matter. And so with a normal menorah, obviously, you've got 7. But with a Chanukiah, and I can't show you one right now because they're all in the window, you've got 8. So with Sukkot, we've got a 7-day celebration, but it's also an 8th day celebration. And if we think of Hanukkah, it's also an 8-day celebration. Why? Because it's celebrated as a Sukkot Sheni. It has to have that added 8th day in there. And now that we know that that servant, the shamash, is not vital, it's not critical, it's only utilitarian, now it makes more sense. Now it's easier to see Hanukkah as that Sukkot Sheni for which they had designated it. So 14, we've got 7 as a significant number, and then we double it for Sukkot. 14 for the dedication of the temple, which is vital if we're to understand the prophecy of Haggai, or Haggai if you're Southern Baptist. Haggai talks about a blessing that's going to be instituted on the 24th of Kislev, which we know is the day prior to Hanukkah. And he says this blessing will be from this day forward. But in order to understand it, and I might be able to share a PowerPoint with you, but he says you have to go back, and this is exactly what Zechariah says, to understand this miracle that's going to happen, or this blessing, you have to go back to the foundation, the time that the foundation of the temple was laid, which actually was in the month of Passover Sheni, Pesach Sheni, 1 month after the Passover, because you would have missed the Passover because of a corpse or a far journey. And it was completed at Sukkot Sheni, 1 month after Sukkot. So if you had missed Sukkot because of a corpse or you were on a long journey, then you would observe it a month later if you could. And so it was finished at the Sheni, Sukkot Sheni. It was started at Pesach Sheni. It was finished at Sukkot Sheni. They waited an entire year, and then they dedicate at Sukkot itself. But with a double, a 14-day celebration, plus one. So this number 14 is significant. Sukkot is nicknamed the Feast of the Nations because it's at this feast that the 70 bulls are offered on behalf of the nations themselves. That's actually what got Jerusalem, Jews, the temple, the high priest out of hot water with Alexander the Great. Because as he's going to destroy them, they march out to meet him and say, don't you know that we make sacrifices for you in our temple? It's the Feast of the Nations at Sukkot. We sacrifice for the nations. If you knew what we were doing on your behalf for you out there among the nations, the last thing you would want to do is destroy this temple because it's prophetic. And that's the thing with Cain and Abel. They were keeping Sukkot, Miketz Yamim, a feast at the end of days. That's Sukkot. When they kept Sukkot, it was part of a prophecy of restoration. Nations that had yet to be born, they're still basically just a first family at that point in history. But for nations yet to be born, they made sacrifices. They took gifts to the altar, Miketz Yamim, at the end of days. Why? Because at the end of days, the nations are going to be gathered at Sukkot. So just keeping Sukkot is fine. It's obeying a commandment, but it's not enough because what you're doing, just like Cain and Abel, you have a choice. You can keep Sukkot and hold something back. Might be personal preparedness. You just weren't ready. It might be, I don't trust people to take the best that I have. Or maybe it's no one will see what I'm holding back. Maybe no one will know. Whatever your reason is for not bringing your best when you gather at Sukkot, what you're doing is you're actually stating that you don't care about anyone but yourself. The same way that Cain did. See, if keeping Sukkot is a prophecy of the end of days, he told you at the first observance of Sukkot in Genesis, when they brought their sacrifices at the end of days, at that point, he told you it was the end of days. And so Cain and Abel, what they were doing at that first Sukkot we hear of is just as important as the last Sukkot we know of. When Zechariah talks about the Feast of the Nations, when the nations will come in and they will worship in Jerusalem, they'll bring the best that they have. That's what we're doing when we observe Sukkot. And in the temple context, Sukkot was inaugurated with a double Sukkot, 14 days, the number of Messiah. The Messiah doubles, if that helps us make sense of Sukkot. The plan all along for the Feast of the Nations was so Messiah could double everything. It wasn't about just these people. Yeshua said, I have sheep from another fold. I'm going to double up here. Just like Solomon did at the dedication of the temple, what does he do? He prays in the dedication and he prays for the nations. He says, not just Israel, not just your people here, but he says, those people from among the nations, when they turn toward this, your holy house, and they spread out their hands in prayer towards your holy house, hear them and answer their prayers. That was the Sukkot prayer that Solomon prayed at the double Sukkot celebration and dedication. So Sukkot is not just, the most wonderful time of the year, at least for us. It's prophecy. It's living out every step you take. Those 7, no, 8 days of Sukkot, they are prophetic steps that you're taking in your own life. And they're just as critical to the end of days as Cain and Abel's steps were at the end of days, at the beginning of days. If that's making sense, I don't know if it is or not, but that's exactly what Haggai prophesied. He said, you have to consider this blessing that will come, a day that hadn't happened yet. And to understand it, he says you have to understand from this day forward. And then he gives the 24th of Kislev. He says, but then and before. And in the whole context of what he's prophesying, he's listing things that are brought at Sukkot as offerings and gifts and tithes, things that are brought at the end of days. So that double Sukkot set a standard. The number of Messiah, 14. The dedication of the temple, where those 70 sacrificial bulls were offered on behalf of the nations. It has a nickname, Sukkot does, which is the Feast of Asif. And that is the root of Joseph. So when we're reading about the life of Joseph, the blessings of Joseph, whether we're talking about Jacob or Moses later on, whenever we read about Joseph, we have a word association, and we can best understand Joseph in the context of the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of the Nations. That's very important that we not separate him from his prophetic life, prophesying of that gathering of the nations, the sheep from the nations. And it had to start with gathering his own brothers, because he had been that blunderer in the field. And the more we blunder in the field in our relationships with one another, the longer it takes to gather the sheep, so that our dreams can truly be fulfilled. There's still a huge disconnect among brothers and sisters in Messiah. But if the number of Messiah is 14 and we are of his generations, then we have to figure out how to be good shepherds. We have to quit blundering around in the field. We have to realize that this great dream, insight, revelation that he's given us concerning the Torah and the Shabbat and the feasts and eating kosher, that these things are not to force others to bow down to us because we are somehow more righteous or elevated than they are, but instead, these things were revealed to us to make us better brothers and sisters, so that at the end of days, we could be instruments of gathering instead of scattering. In this Torah portion, and remember, Asif, the Feast of Asif, is the Feast of Sukkot. It's the root of Joseph, and it means to add, to increase, to grow, to gather. And therefore, we kind of get at the first dedication Sukkot in the temple that Solomon increased, he grew as he gathered Israel. He doubled the Sukkot and increased it. And that's what Joseph's role is, his prophetic role is, because he is associated with the Feast of the Nations, Sukkot. His role is to illustrate the increase and the doubling that Messiah will do. And who was Yeshua's father, or at least his earthly father? His name was Yosef. He will add. So even his earthly father is passing down to Yeshua a prophecy of Sukkot. He will add. And, I know Christians are way off track with Santa Claus and Christmas trees, that all sort of pagan elements have invaded their observance. But like I say, it's going to be very simple one day, at least for the righteous among them. They're just like everyone else. They have sincere people and they have posers. Within Hebrew roots, there are serious people and there are posers. Within any religion, we have sincere people, we have posers. I think once the sincere people see the untruths stripped away from Christmas, and they figure out what Hanukkah and the Feast of Sukkot are all about, it's not as though it's going to be brand new information. Because see, even though they went to a solar calendar and they lost the month of Kislev that Haggai prophesied, what do they keep? What do they keep associating with Christmas, even though Christmas is wrong? They have kept some of the symbols, and I think just keeping those symbols, at least for the righteous, it's going to help them reconnect with not just Sukkot, but even with Hanukkah, which has even more to do with regathering the lost sheep, with regathering the remnant of Jacob as a Sukkot Sheni. It's like a second chance. Just when you think it's over and the chances are over, he'll make a second chance. And they still got the emblems. I mean, the shepherds by night, that's what we know about Hanukkah. It's associated with the 7 shepherds. And that's why I wanted us to go back to, well, before we go back there, where we're going back to is Genesis 29. But in the book, what I point out is that 14 times in this Torah portion, when Judah draws near to Joseph, right? Remember, Joseph has lost his identity to his brother. His own brother doesn't recognize him. And when Judah decides to live sacrificially, to offer himself in the place of his brother, again, Judah has now become a true shepherd. Remember, was it the sheep shearing that he got into the trouble with Tamar? These sheep keep popping up. In association with the sheep shearing, even though Judah's going to visit who he thinks is a prostitute, it's associated with that specific season that we see increase in his life. Now he's going to have twins that descend through Tamar. And so he's moved from wanting to sell a brother and scatter him to actually enlarging the tribes of Israel. Right? He comes back to the family, and you can see increase in addition within the family. And because of the loss of those first 2 sons, now he identifies with his father's loss, and he offers himself. He says, take me. If anything happens to Benjamin, I'll stand in and I'll be the sacrifice. And what is he doing there? He's making sure that another brother is not lost. He's not willing for more scattering to happen. And so as he draws near, there are going to be 14 different references to their father. Even though Judah doesn't know who he is yet, every other word out of Judah's mouth sounds like my father, my father, my father. And all of a sudden you realize that he's developed a real heart for the father instead of a heart of selfishness. Because as he's developed a heart for his father Jacob, he's also developed a heart for Benjamin. A heart for Benjamin that he didn't have for Joseph before he suffered. And that's what suffering does for us. It helps us to develop a heart for people that we didn't have before. If we're righteous, now if we're unrighteous, it just hardens us against people. It makes us more mistrustful, distrustful, angry, mean, bitter. But in the righteous, that suffering actually starts to do some good things, because now we're worried about our relationship with the Father, and we're also worried about our relationship with our brothers and sisters. We're not willing to see people scattered who don't have to be. And sometimes we'll say, you know what, it wasn't my fault, but I'll take the blame anyway. I can do it. And that's what Judah does. 14 times he references their father as he draws near. That's the title of the Torah portion is Vayigash, and drew near. And Judah starts emphasizing these 14 references to his father. He talks about his mother, and 6 times, significantly, he uses the word brother. And you already know from Creation Gospel that 6 is the number of a man, and it's also the number of a beast. The last time Judah saw Joseph, that he knew it was Joseph, what did he act like? A beast. He had the 666, but it was the beast 6. And they even go so far as to tear the clothes and put blood on them and let their father think that a wild beast tore him. That jealousy is the characteristic of a wild beast. But now, 6 times he says brother. Now the 6 has become the positive aspect of the 6, which is attachment. Remember when Levi is named? The middle letter of his name is a vav. It's not a beit. And the vav is an attachment. It's a peg. It's a nail. It's a way that you hook and you hold on to things. The vav, it's the number of a man. So it's either the number of close sacrificial relationship, or it's the number of the beast, whichever one you want it to be. One hooks you together with human beings, and the other one tears it apart. That's significant. Before, Judah was not attached to his brother. But by the time he comes back and makes this appeal to Joseph, who now, remember, represents Sukkot, now he attaches back and starts 6 times. He talks about brother. And he reminds Joseph, you've got the power to stop this human disconnection, this curse that's on our family, this curse of separation. You, Pharaoh's assistant, I can't pronounce his Egyptian name, but you, Mr. Pharaoh's assistant, you have the power to stop this breaking of the vav, of the human relationship, the connection. And he's using words of humility. He calls Joseph Lord. He calls himself your servant. And so now you've got a living picture of Messiah Yeshua, the one who comes to repair the vav, the one who comes to repair the relationship, to repair not just the relationship with brothers, but when you do that, it also repairs the relationship with his father. Because all these things are connected. It's all one. And so now, what do we have? We have an assembly, a gathering of people, and with Joseph as the focal point of this regathering, prophetically, we can understand why Zechariah, when he prophesies about a Sukkot, a feast of the nations, where the nations go up. Because it's a reconciliation to the Father through their brother Judah and Israel and those who were faithful. And so when we're keeping Sukkot, it's not a casual thing. It's not a family vacation, although it can be. It's not 8 days of camping, although it can be. We're living prophecy and we're living outside of time. Just as much as Abel, because see, it was Abel's blood. It says it cried out from the ground. He says, it's your brother's blood. Your brother's blood is crying out from the ground. Just like Judah, he keeps mentioning 6 times, brother. And we need to stop this disconnection of Solomon, a consciousness that we have brothers that we've never met them. And up to this point, the surrounding nations are pretty much enemies. You can make treaties with them, but you don't really want them up in your house, although later Solomon did that. He started marrying wives to make political alliances. But at the dedication of the temple, at least, he starts praying for those nations, even if he inappropriately starts trying to gather them later through wives. Sukkot is prophecy. So let's go back to Genesis 29. And I'm going to read out of the NASB. It says, then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. He looked and saw a well in the field. Now remember, the field is the world. That's the symbolism. And it says, behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, for from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. Now there's 3 flocks of sheep. That could be important. It says, when all the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. So it wasn't one of those things where as the flocks came up one by one, they would roll the stone away. All the flocks had to be in one place before the stone could be rolled away. And Jacob said to them, my brothers, where are you from? And they said, we are from Haran. It's interesting that he calls them brothers. And he said to them, do you know Lavan, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. And he said to them, is it well with him? And they said, it is well. And here is Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep. All right, here comes Rachel with the sheep. Now, I'm not sure if she's bringing that 3rd flock, or if there's already 3 flocks there and she's bringing a 4th. If she's bringing a 4th, we understand from the creation days that 4 is a number of spiritual authority. But if she's bringing the 3rd, then she's bringing a number of resurrection. Something that had appeared to be dead on the surface is resurrected. Or if it's the 4th flock she's bringing, then she's bringing it with a number of authority, at least in the spirit. He said, behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered. In other words, Jacob is telling them, why are you sitting around this well at this time of day? You should have them out in the pastures, tending to them. Pasture. Remember Yeshua saying, pasture, shepherd my sheep, feed my sheep. So Genesis 29:7 should make you think of that passage, because it's so, we know it's so important in the Gospels. It's one of the last words that we'll hear from Yeshua before he ascends to the Father, telling Peter, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, pasture my sheep. And Jacob is saying basically the same thing. It's not time for the livestock to be gathered at the well. Water the sheep and go. Pasture them. Take them to get something to eat. So it's a timing issue with Jacob. He's not exactly a man of the field, but he's out here in the field trying to give real shepherds orders. I don't know if they knew that he was not a man of the field, but or if he was like, his son Joseph blundering in the field, maybe they couldn't tell that, but he knew enough about flocks to know what time of day they should be out eating and when they should be watered. And so he, the stranger, walks in and says, water the sheep, go, pasture them. And they said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered. And they roll the stone from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. So again, you can tell in this conversation, it's not just about the time of day when you should or shouldn't be watering sheep. They're giving us very significant clues about the flocks. The shepherds of the field said, we can't water them until all the flocks are gathered. And that kind of sounds like Yeshua saying, you know what, I have sheep who aren't of this fold. There's a flock out there you can't see. And it says, while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep. And now it adds something that it's never added before for anyone, whether it's Abel or Abraham or even Jacob. Even though we know Rivka was also a shepherdess, it doesn't specifically state it. We just know it's true. Now, this is going to be the first time that anyone, male or female, is designated with the Hebrew word for shepherdess, ruah. Why? Because it's a sound alike. I say ani ruah. That means I see, feminine. I'm female. If I were male, I would say ani rueh. And it's the same sound difference when you're talking about a shepherd or a shepherdess. Ani ruah, I'm a shepherdess. If I were male, ani rueh, I'm a shepherd. So we have a significant verse. We have a first mention. And it says that Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. She was a gatherer. But in this context, in this field, and remember the field is the world, Rachel, the shepherdess, becomes the catalyst for all the flocks being gathered. That says, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep, he doesn't just see her and see how beautiful he is. He's not just swept off his feet. It mentions he also sees the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Now, to me, that's very significant because we're getting all this imagery again of the sheep. And now I'm going to skip over to workbook 2. Just try to keep up. We have a significant prophecy about Rachel. And this is Joseph's mother. And so what is Rachel, his mother, passing on to Joseph? Well, at first glance, not much shepherding ability. But he learns, just like Jacob. Jacob had a little savvy. He at least knew what time of day the sheep were supposed to be at the well and when they were supposed to be in the pasture. But there's a lot more to shepherding than that. But Rachel had a unique ability. It was only when Rachel showed up that all the flocks were considered gathered in one place. And this is going to be passed down to her. Just like we can see with Rebecca, we know that she loves Jacob. It's her, if we want to say deceptive ability, but her unique ability to know prophecy and to be courageous enough to act on it. Rebecca hands that down to Jacob. By the same token, because remember, Rebecca was put into Sarah's tent. So what does she pass on to Jacob? A love for the tent, a love for studying the Torah. And now we have Rachel. Instead of passing something on to a daughter, Rachel is passing on to Joseph this unique ability to shepherd. Because of her, the flock is considered gathered in one place. She controls the time even when it's out of time, which is interesting. Now let's go to Jeremiah 31:10. And we're going to compare her. Rachel, remember, means ewe lamb. And Abel is Hebel in Hebrew, and his name means a breath or a vapor. And what do they have in common? They both disappear out of their stories early. Cain kills Abel, he disappears. And then all that can happen is his blood cries out from the ground. And then we're going to look at Rachel, what happened to her. She's basically buried on the side of the road. In fact, if we go to Genesis 35:16, it says, then they journeyed from Beit El, the house of God, even though it's not, there's different Beit Els, the name is significant, the house of God. Now, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrat, and in Ephrat, you can hear another association with the feast of Sukkot, because it means fruitfulness. And you bring fruit at Sukkot. Cain brought of the fruit of the ground, but he didn't bring the best of the fruit of the ground that you're supposed to bring at Sukkot, because you're living prophecy when you go to Sukkot. So when there was still some distance to go to Ephrat, and let's just play a game here. Let's substitute the word Sukkot. When there was still some distance to go to Sukkot, Rachel began to give birth, and she suffered severe labor. When she was in severe labor, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for now you have another son. It came about, as her soul was departing, before she died, that she named him Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrat, that is Beit Lechem, or the house of bread. Jacob set up a pillar over her grave. That is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. And if you've ever been to her grave, it's right exactly where the passage says that it is. But notice, we've been talking about doubles, like a double Sukkot. And what happens here is Benjamin's name is doubled. So is he Ben-Oni, or is he Benjamin, the son of the right hand? Which, in Jewish expectation, the son of the right hand, we pray in the liturgy, bear your holy arm for salvation, Yeshuat. And so the right hand of Adonai is Yeshua. He's the son of the right hand. And this is the name that Jacob gives him. But what do we know from the creation gospel paradigm? It's the natural that's revealed first, and then the spiritual. So we have a son who is being added. Remember, Joseph was named Yosef. He will add. Okay, here's the added son. And this son has a double name. He has two names. Now, in the natural realm, in the first revelation of this son, he's known as Ben-Oni, or the son of my suffering. It's a prophetic name. What do we know about Yeshua? In his first revealing to the nations, he was a son of suffering. But there is yet another revelation to come. Benjamin. For some, we already see him as Benjamin, the son of the right hand. But for some, he was merely a son of suffering, but not the Messiah. And maybe it's from this particular passage that the rabbis are getting the idea of two messiahs. There's debate. Is there one Messiah or is there two? Of course, in their context, there's a Messiah in every generation. But in terms of the Messiah, they talk about Messiah ben Yosef, that suffering servant like Ben-Oni. And then they also talk about Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, the son of David, the conquering king. and the naming of Benjamin falling short of Ephrat. There's still a distance to go. Now, from there, it's within sight. If you've been to Rachel's tomb, Bethlehem is in sight. But it's in Bethlehem where we get all this, and we identify it with Christmas just because it's been conditioned into us. But strip out your Christmas conditioning for a while, if you can. It's hard to do that because it's everywhere you look right now. But if we were to put all of this imagery back where it belonged, associated with the Feast of Sukkot and the Feast of Hanukkah, because Hanukkah was a Sukkot Sheni, it's supposed to look very much like Sukkot, just at a different time, Haggai says. Instead of back in Tishrei, the 15th of Tishrei, Haggai says this particular blessing is going to occur on the 24th of Kislev. Okay? So they look very similar. But she dies just short of this fruitfulness of Sukkot. And this is how she's similar to Abel. Remember, he brought his gift at the end of days at Sukkot. And we don't know if he completed the days of Sukkot. We don't know on which day he died in the field. We know that he and Cain were arguing in the field. We don't know exactly which day he died. Did he die short of fulfilling the days, the 7 and the 8 days of Sukkot? We don't know for sure. But now, and by the way, I'm on page 12 of workbook 2 if you're trying to figure out where I am. Notice that we had 3 men in Genesis 29. And typically, and there's really no support for this, but we tend to think of 3 wise men because we read about gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So we just said, okay, there were 3 guys. Well, they might have all brought gold, frankincense, but there might have been a bunch of wise men. But typically, somehow what got handed down was 3 men. How many men were at the well in the field waiting for Rachel? 3. All 3 had flocks that they would not consider complete until Rachel arrived, so that the stone could be rolled away. Right? So let's go to Jeremiah 31:10. It says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O nations." Now this is to the nations. So think Feast of the Nations, Sukkot. "Declare in the coastlands afar off and say, he who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock." At that point, you're expected to assimilate everything you already know about shepherds and shepherdesses from the time of Abel. "For the Lord has ransomed Jacob and redeemed him from the hand of the one who was stronger than he. They will come and shout for joy on the height of Zion, and they will be radiant over the bounty of the Lord." And listen to how many Sukkot products are listed right here. "Over the grain and the new wine and the oil, over the young of the flock and the herd. And their life will be like a watered garden." This can be another place the water pouring ceremony grew from in the 1st century at Sukkot. It says, "They will never languish again. Then the virgin will rejoice in the dance, the young men and the old together, for I will turn their mourning," remember Yom Kippur is a mourning day, that turns into joy just a few days later. "And I will comfort them and give them joy for their sorrow." That's what Sukkot does. It gives us joy, this season of our joy, for the sorrow of Yom Kippur. "I will fill the soul of the priest with abundance." And that's exactly what happens because you start bringing your tithes in so the priest can eat. "And my people will be satisfied with my goodness." That's exactly what we're supposed to do at Sukkot. Eat and be satisfied and give thanks to the one who gave us the power to get what we obtained in that year. "Thus says the Lord." Now listen to the switch here. "A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation, and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. And you say, what? Yes, they are. Nothing happened to Joseph and Benjamin. They lived to ripe old ages. She's the one who died. Why is she crying? She should be crying for herself. But she's crying for her children. It says she refuses to be comforted for her children. She's just like Abel. The blood is still crying out from the ground. Remember, she was just buried on the side of the road. She's not in the cave at Machpelah with all the other couples. Now that seems like a pretty, terrible disrespect from Jacob to Rachel, unless there's a prophetic meaning to it. As long as she's not buried in the cave of the couples, remember, it also means the cave of the doubles. Since we're talking about sevens and 14, Rachel refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. But thus says the Lord, restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work will be rewarded, declares the Lord. Remember, that's what Sukkot is all about. It's the time of your reward. That's when you get to enjoy the reward of all your work. Remember, Ephratah, today it's Ephrat, but Ephratah, Bethlehem, which is the Arab side now, you can see it from where she was buried, but she still stopped short of Sukkot. She didn't quite make it. Why is she mourning? She's stuck in Yom Kippur. She's stuck on a day of mourning. She dies in childbirth to the point that she says, son of my suffering. So now he says, your work will be rewarded. You will reach the goal. Your children will reach Sukkot, declares the Lord. They will return from the land of the enemy. Now we know who these children are that she's weeping over. These are children who have disappeared into the land of the enemy. He says, there is hope for your future, declares the Lord, and your children will return to their own territory. They're coming back. And see, this makes sense. This makes perfect sense. Because as we go into the prophecies, and I taught a little bit on this at the Hanukkah conference, when we go back to these prophecies that are connected with Hanukkah and the seventh shepherd and the 8 princes, then we know that part of that, let me try to find the slide here if I can. Okay. This is from Micah 5:1 through 8. It's kind of a long quote, but I want you to hear it all. Because it explains Yeshua. It explains why Rachel was crying. But it's also going to explain why she's being told that her work will be rewarded and her children will return. It says, now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. Interesting that it's daughter. They have laid siege against us. With a rod, they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephratah, Rachel couldn't get there. She died too soon. Too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore, he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Remember, Rachel is bearing a child as she prophesies. It says, then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel, and he will arise and shepherd his flock. In the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. This one will be our peace. when the Assyrian invades our land, when he tramples on our citadels, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. They will shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword and the land of Nimrod at its entrances, which if you were on the tour with us this last year, you saw that, the gates of Nimrod right there. So he will deliver us from the Assyrian when he attacks our land, when he tramples our territory. Then the remnant of Jacob will be among many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on vegetation, which do not wait for man or delay for the sons of men. And that's what I want to focus on right there. The remnant of Jacob will be among the nations, among many peoples. So all this sheep talk that we see throughout Scripture, think of it in this context. Think of Yeshua saying, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Take care of my sheep. Take care of my sheep. Take care of my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. Well, how do we know that they're his sheep? We'll see at Hanukkah, at the Feast of Dedication, to the people who said, tell us plainly if you're the Messiah. He said, my sheep know my voice. They will follow me and they will not follow another. But see, if you can't hear Yeshua, then you may not be one of his sheep. But if you hear his voice, you're one of those sheep being gathered. Because later in prophecy, Rachel says, who are these? Where did these come from? She doesn't recognize them, like Joseph. He wasn't recognized. But what happens? Increase. He adds at the Feast of the Nations. Mother Rachel is crying for us, refusing to be comforted until we are gathered at the Feast of the Nations, until Yeshua brings those flocks back to the one place. That spirit of Rachel, that spirit of not being willing to be separated, being that last shepherdess to come in so that the flock is considered whole and gathered in one place. And then it says Jacob removed the stone from the well. But right now the remnant of Jacob is among many peoples, and Yeshua is still gathering in, gathering in, gathering in. He's bringing us in. How do we know? We know his voice because the prophecy talks about how they are like dew on thirsty grass. That's the song of Moses. That's exactly what Moses said when he taught them the song, that they were supposed to receive the Torah, receive the words of the song of Moses like dew on thirsty grass. So if you woke up one day and all of a sudden you wanted to study Torah and you never had before, you were thirsty grass and you were a thirsty sheep. And you said, what am I doing out here? I'm supposed to be heading to a well. I can hear some lady crying because she doesn't know I'm out here. She thinks I'm dead and I'm not. I'm not dead at all. How did Gideon really know he was supposed to go up and conquer the enemy? Because he could wring the water out of the sheep wool. And as we receive this Torah like dew on thirsty grass, we should be getting to the point when the battle draws near that he can just wring the water. We're just dripping wet with his word, because that's what sheep wool does. When it starts raining and the dew of heaven falls upon a sheep who knows his voice, then we soak it up. It doesn't bounce off. It's soaked up. And we're ready to start heading home. We're ready for Rachel to start leading those sheep to the watering. We're out here feeding right now. We're in the pastures feeding on his word. But Rachel is crying until we come home and Yeshua removes the stone from the well. And that's what Yeshua said at Sukkot. He said, if you're thirsty, come to me and drink. I will give you drink if you will come to me. And I think that's the beauty of this Torah portion with the season that we're in, with the prophecy of Rachel explaining why we go through suffering. When it seems we've stopped short of the goal, when we're just not going to reach it, when it feels like we're dying, when we only see bitterness, I'm trying so hard and I just can't get there. Don't give up. Because the prophecy is, I will turn your Yom Kippur basically into your Sukkot. Don't stop at Yom Kippur. Keep going. You're going to be gathered. And you're going to be surprised at how many other sheep are gathering at the well with you. If you know the voice of Yeshua, he will gather you. Because he is the Mashiach. 14 times Judah says, my father. 6 times, my brother. What are we learning? We're learning about the Father and we're learning about our brothers. And when we lay our lives down for Benjamin, for a younger brother, so that we won't allow our father to suffer at the separation, then we're ready for the well. We're ready to be gathered.